All right, today we're diving into a pretty dramatic story out of Nepal. It's all about how a new generation, a generation armed with just their smartphones, really, found its voice and went up against an entire government.
I mean, it's a question that sounds like it's straight out of a political thriller, right? How can a bunch of tweets and memes, how does that translate into enough real-world power to actually force a prime minister out of office? It sounds almost impossible. But here's the thing, it's not fiction. It actually happened. And digging into how it happened, well, that gives us a really fascinating glimpse into the future of political change, especially in our super-connected world.
All right, so let's set the stage. First up, Nepal's political shockwave. This is the story of how a prime minister, KP Sharma Oli, was actually forced to resign.
So what led to that shockwave? You could call it a political tinderbox. We need to understand the grievances that were building up under Oli's government, the stuff that really fueled the fire. Okay, so the public's anger really boiled down to three big things. First, there was this growing sense that the government was becoming way too authoritarian. Then you had these constant, widespread allegations of corruption just swirling around. And on top of all that, there was this general feeling that the country was just being mismanaged. And look, these weren't small complaints, you know? These were deep, fundamental frustrations about the direction the nation was heading.
And you've got to understand, this wasn't something that just happened overnight. It was more of a slow burn. The pressure just kept building and building over time. It started with some political tensions early on, then those concerns about corruption and governance just got louder and louder, until finally, public anger just hit its boiling point.
So you have this tinderbox of discontent, right? The next part of our story is the spark that lit the whole thing up, a youth uprising. So how did all that simmering anger get ignited? Well, the answer came from a totally new generation of activists.
And this is really the crucial point. Who was actually behind all this? The main organizers weren't seasoned politicians. They were student groups and, members of Gen Z. We're talking about young people who literally grew up with the internet in their hands. They're digital natives. And they saw what was happening in their country and just decided to use the tools they knew best to demand a change.
And this is where you can see the huge difference in their whole approach. Traditional protests, they're often top-down, kind of slow to get going. This movement was the complete opposite. It was decentralized, it was lightning fast, everything was coordinated online, which meant they could mobilize thousands of people in a matter of hours, not days or weeks.
So they basically had this playbook, and it was brilliant. Step 1, grievances go viral online. People get angry. Step 2, that online outrage gets channeled. Activists use digital platforms to make actual, concrete plans. Then, and this is the critical part, that online anger spills over into the real world. We're talking massive street demonstrations. But it didn't stop there. They'd take pictures and videos from the protests, share them back online, which just amplified the pressure and created this powerful, relentless feedback loop.
So their tactics were this really powerful mix of old school and new school. On one hand, you had huge street demonstrations, right, that showed their physical numbers. Can't ignore that. They also used these really powerful symbolic acts to make sure they grabbed media headlines. But then they combined that with super fast online information sharing. That meant they could literally outpace the government's official responses, keeping them constantly on the back foot. The pressure was just relentless.
Okay, so the protests happened. The pressure was immense. What came next? Let's talk about the fallout, the immediate consequences, and the long-term risks of this whole uprising.
So what was the single biggest outcome? Well, bottom line, it worked. The protests actually forced Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli to resign. I mean, that is a stunning victory, and it triggered a huge political shift in the country.
But the effects didn't just stop there. Domestically, the resignation threw things into a state of instability, and it raised some pretty serious questions about the strength of Nepal's democratic institutions. And on a bigger scale, regionally, it had the potential to really shift the country's foreign policy, especially its relationships with its very powerful neighbors.
And this brings us to a really crucial point. On one hand, yes, the protests succeeded. They got rid of a leader that people had lost faith in. But on the other hand, the way it all happened, this political collapse, it also exposed some serious vulnerabilities in Nepal's democratic system. And that's something the country is going to have to navigate very, very carefully from here on out.
All right, so let's get to the big question. Why does this uprising in Nepal really matter? Why should we all be paying attention? Let's zoom out a bit and look at the global lesson here.
If you take away just one thing from this whole story, let it be this. A generation of young people,
connected by technology, now has the power to fundamentally and, maybe more importantly, rapidly change the course of national politics.
And this really isn't just a local story. I mean, if you're a student of political science or international relations, this is an absolutely vital case study. If you're preparing for something like the civil service exams, this is essential stuff to know. But really, for all of us, it's just a crystal clear example of how young people are shaping politics in the 21st century.
And that really leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to chew on. The tools these young people used in Nepal, they're not unique. They're in all of our pockets. So as digital connectivity continues to spread across the globe, the real question isn't if something like this will happen again. It's simply, where will it happen next?